From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
In less than 2 years, my administration has accomplished more than almost any administration in the history of our country. America's so true. Didn't expect that reaction, but that's okay.
World leaders at the United Nations General Assembly burst into laughter when President Trump boasts about his accomplishments. Trump praises North Korea, attacks Germany, and accuses Iran of sowing chaos, death, and destruction, drawing scorn from Iranian President Hassan Rouhani.
It is ironic that the U.S. government does not even conceal its plan for overthrowing the same government it invites to talks.
We'll get response to Trump's threats to Iran from Juan Cole, author of Engaging the Muslim World. Trump's fiercely anti-immigrant senior advisor, Stephen Miller, reportedly wrote Trump's UN address. We'll speak with his uncle, David Glosser, who calls his nephew an immigration hypocrite, saying his family would not have made it to the United States if the U.S. didn't accept refugees. Then comedian Bill Cosby is sentenced to 3 to 10 years for aggravated indecent assault for drugging and sexually assaulting Andrea Constant, one of about 60 women accusers.
I'm very happy to know that Mr. Cosby will do time in prison, that he is touchable like he touched us unwillingly. This is
okay.
All right.
Good.
We've got justice. We'll get response from another of Cosby's accusers, artist and actor Lily Bernard, who was in the courtroom when Bill Cosby was sentenced. She says he drugged and raped her in the early 90s when he mentored her in preparation for her guest starring role on The Cosby Show. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump addressed the United Nations General Assembly Tuesday, praising his administration's America First policies, assailing the International Criminal Court, accusing Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro of corruption, announcing new sanctions against Maduro's inner circle, and accusing Iran of sowing chaos, death, and destruction. Many of the world leaders and dignitaries in the General Assembly erupted in laughter when Trump boasted about his accomplishments as U.S. president.
In less than 2 years, my administration has accomplished more than almost any administration in the history of our country. America's so true. Didn't expect that reaction, but that's okay.
Trump's appearance came as his national security advisor issued another dire warning against Iran. Speaking at a forum for opponents of the Iranian government on the sidelines of the General Assembly, John Bolton threatened there would be hell to pay if Iran crosses the U.S. The threat came after the Trump administration defied U.S. allies last May by reneging on the Iran nuclear deal and unilaterally reimposing sanctions against Iran. And it came as Trump claimed he'd turned down requests that he meet with Iranian President Hassan Rouhani at the General Assembly, tweeting, quote, "I'm sure he's an absolutely lovely man." On Tuesday, President Rouhani responded to the threat, saying the U.S. is guilty of recklessness and economic terrorism.
It is ironic that the U.S. government does not even conceal its plan for overthrowing the same government it invites to talks.
President Rouhani also said he did not request to meet with President Trump. We'll have more on Trump's appearance at the UN General Assembly and growing U.S. threats against Iran after headlines with University of Michigan professor Juan Cole. Republicans on the Senate Judiciary Committee will turn to an outside female counsel to question Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh's accuser, Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, during a high-stakes hearing Thursday. As Blasey Ford is set to testify, Kavanaugh attempted to rape her when she was 15 years old. The Washington Post reports Republicans have selected Rachel Mitchell, Sex Crimes Bureau Chief for the Maricopa County Attorney's Office in Phoenix, Arizona, and longtime registered Republican to do the questioning. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell confirmed Tuesday the committee had hired a, quote, female assistant to, quote, ask these questions in a respectful and professional way. All 11 Republicans on the Senate Judiciary Committee are men. There has never been a Republican woman on the Senate Judiciary Committee. This comes as USA Today reports Dr. Christine Blasey Ford has submitted 4 affidavits to the Senate corroborating her claims that Kavanaugh sexually assaulted her. The declarations from Ford's husband and 3 of her friends say she told them of the assault before Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court. Meanwhile, Senate Judiciary Committee Chair Republican Chuck Grassley said Tuesday he would not delay Kavanaugh's confirmation process to give more time for authorities to investigate accusations by a second Kavanaugh accuser, Deborah Ramirez, who says Kavanaugh exposed himself and thrust his genitals in her face during a college party in a dorm room when they were both students at Yale University. On Tuesday, President Trump lashed out against Ramirez at the United Nations, questioning her account and saying the charges are part of a Democratic Party con game.
And now a new charge comes up, and she said, well, it might not be him, and there were gaps, and she said she was totally inebriated, and she was all messed up, and she doesn't know it was him, but it might have been him. Oh, gee, let's not make him a Supreme Court judge because of that. This is a con game being played by the Democrats.
Trump's attack comes as over 2,200 Yale women alumni have signed an open letter supporting Deborah Ramirez. Republican leaders have set a Senate Judiciary Committee vote on Kavanaugh's nomination for Friday, just one day after Christine Blasey Ford is set to testify. This all comes as attorney Michael Avenatti says a third woman will come forward before Thursday with new evidence against Kavanaugh, and officials in Montgomery County, Maryland, are reportedly looking into a 4th potential allegation of sexual assault against Brett Kavanaugh during his senior year in high school. A Pennsylvania judge has sentenced comedian Bill Cosby to 3 to 10 years in prison for aggravated indecent assault, labeling him a sexually violent predator. After Tuesday's sentencing, Cosby's publicist and spokesperson, Andrew Wyatt, compared Judge Stephen O'Neill's sentence to the sexual assault accusations against Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh.
What is going on in Washington today with Judge Kavanaugh is part of that sex war that Judge O'Neill, along with his wife, are a part of.
In April, a jury found Cosby guilty of 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault for drugging and sexually assaulting Andrea Constand, one of 60 women who've accused Cosby of sexual assaults dating back decades. Constand's was the only case still within the statute of limitations. Another Cosby accuser, Chelan Lasha, spoke just ahead of Cosby's sentencing.
He ruined my life at 17 years old. He took away my future, my financial, everything about me, and lived his life on over and over and over again with no regards. And I think he needs to pay for what he's done to everyone. I have nightmares about it this very day. And I want them to go away, just like him.
Later in the broadcast, we'll speak with another of Cosby's accusers, Lily Bernard. In the Gaza Strip, hundreds of Palestinians held a funeral Tuesday for a man who was shot and killed a day earlier near Israel's separation barrier with the besieged Palestinian territory. Gaza's health ministry says 90 others were injured after Israeli forces used tear gas and live bullets to disperse Monday's protests. Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have been protesting since March 30th under the banner of the Great March of Return. Since then, Israeli forces have killed at least 174 Palestinians and wounded over 18,000 others. Tuesday's funeral came as the World Bank said in a new report Gaza's economy is in free fall and collapsing due to Israel's 11-year blockade of the Palestinian territory. The report found youth unemployment in Gaza is about 70%, adding, quote, a situation where people struggle to make ends meet, suffer from worsening poverty, rising unemployment, and deteriorating public services such as health care, water, and sanitation, calls for urgent, real, and sustainable solutions. Argentina's central bank president resigned unexpectedly Tuesday, just 3 months after taking the post. Luis Caputo's departure comes as President Mauricio Macri attempts to win a loan from the International Monetary Fund in exchange for harsh austerity measures. Those measures have spawned massive protests against Argentina, including a 24-hour general strike this week that idled airports, shut down public transportation, and halted other sectors of the economy. This is protester Delfina Grinstein in Buenos Aires.
We're here to protest the IMF deal because we know that we're facing a very bad economic situation, and we're also against paying down the debt because all that money could be used for education and health care.
Back in the United States, a federal judge has restored endangered species status to grizzly bears in and around Wyoming's famed Yellowstone National Park. Tuesday's ruling by District Court Judge Dana Christensen in Montana reverses an order by Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke that threatened Yellowstone's estimated 700 bears, whose population has grown from just 136 when the bears were first listed as endangered in 1975. Zinke's move would have allowed for the first legal grizzly bear hunts in decades. And in Chicago, the legal team defending police officer Jason Van Dyke from murder charges presented a computer-generated video in court Tuesday, calling the 4-minute depiction of the death of Laquan McDonald evidence that the officer acted in self-defense when he shot the unarmed African-American teenager in a hail of gunfire in October 2014. The computer-generated video did not reflect what was recorded in a police dash cam video of the actual incident. It did not include the images of other officers at the scene, and it showed Van Dyke shooting just a fraction of the 16 bullets he actually fired at Laquan McDonald. Jason Van Dyke faces 2 counts of first-degree murder. He's the first police officer in Chicago to stand trial for killing someone on duty in 50 years. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. President Trump has repeatedly attacked his political opponents by saying the world is, quote, laughing at the United States. But on Tuesday, as he addressed the United Nations General Assembly, many of the world's leaders laughed at him when he boasted of his administration's accomplishments.
In less than 2 years, my administration has accomplished more than almost any administration in the history of our country. America's so true. Didn't expect that reaction, but that's okay.
Trump later said his comment was, quote, meant to get some laughter, so it was great. During his address, Trump assailed the International Criminal Court, accused Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro of corruption, and announced new sanctions against members of Maduro's inner circle. And he accused Iran of sowing, quote, chaos, death, and destruction across the Middle East.
Iran's leaders sow chaos, death, and destruction. They do not respect their neighbors or borders or the sovereign rights of nations. Instead, Iran's leaders plunder the nation's resources to enrich themselves and to spread mayhem across the Middle East and far beyond. We cannot allow the world's leading sponsor of terrorism to possess the planet's most dangerous weapons. We ask all nations to isolate Iran's regime as long as its aggression continues, and we ask all nations to support Iran's people as they struggle to reclaim their religious and righteous destiny.
Just hours after Trump's speech, National Security Advisor John Bolton issued a dire warning to Iran.
According to the mullahs in Tehran, we are the great Satan, Lord of the underworld, master of the raging inferno. So I might imagine they would take me seriously that when I assure them today that if you cross us, our allies or our partners, if you harm our citizens, if you continue to lie, cheat, and deceive, yes, there will indeed be hell to pay. The murderous regime and its supporters will face significant consequences if they do not change their behavior. Let my message today be very clear. We are watching, and we will come after you.
Today, President Trump is set to chair a meeting of the UN Security Council on nuclear proliferation. To talk more about Trump's comments at the United Nations, particularly on Iran, we go to Ann Arbor, Michigan, to speak with Juan Cole, professor of history at the University of Michigan. His blog is called Informed Consent. He's the author of many books, Informed Comment, rather. He's the author of many books, including Engaging the Muslim World, his forthcoming book, Muhammad, Prophet of Peace, Amid the Clash of Empires. It's out in October. We welcome you back to Democracy Now!, Professor Cole. Let's start where President Trump started his speech. Let's start with the laughter of the world leaders when Trump boasted about his accomplishments of the last 2 years.
Well, this was a hall full of world leaders who'd actually run administrations, and they've seen the chaos of the Trump administration for the past 2 years. And I think what's amazing is not that this hall of seasoned professionals laughed at him, but that he doesn't get more laughter. In the United States, these cable news programs take him seriously. They've normalized him. He's told thousands of lies, and his rate of lying has increased enormously in recent months. And I think he should be laughed off the screen everywhere.
Oh, well, Professor Cole, I want to ask you, while the president was giving this speech this same week, there was a key announcement, which I think has not gotten a whole lot of publicity, that the governments of the United Kingdom, Germany, France, China, and Russia have all supported an idea to basically break away from the sanctions that President Trump has put on Iran, and to create some kind of a special purpose vehicle, a financial bank in Europe that would allow companies to conduct trade with Iran and not be able to suffer from sanctions. I'm wondering if you could comment about the importance of this sort of declaration of financial independence by these major world powers.
Well, I think in some ways, Juan, it's the one of the more significant developments in the relationship of the United States to Europe since the end of World War II. Europe has most often taken its lead from the United States on world affairs, and here it is directly defying Washington's will. The U.S. Department of the Treasury is the instrument used by administrations to impose sanctions, and those sanctions can be imposed on trade that is conducted in dollars or through U.S. banks. And so what the Europeans are saying is we'll set up a vehicle for Iran to do business with European firms, which will be in euros, and it will sidestep U.S. banks and international exchanges, so as to ensure that some of the economic relief that was promised to Iran for mothballing most of its civilian nuclear enrichment research would come through.
I wanted to go back to Iranian President Rouhani speaking at the United Nations General Assembly, suggesting the U.S. under Trump has adopted a Nazi disposition. He didn't mention Trump by name.
It is unfortunate that we are witnessing rulers in the world who think they can secure their interests better, or at least in the short term ride public sentiments and gain popular support through the fomenting of extremist nationalism and racism, and through xenophobic tendencies resembling a Nazi disposition, as well as through the trampling of global rules and undermining international institutions. It is ironic that the U.S. government does not even conceal its plan for overthrowing the same government it invites to talks.
So that was President Rouhani. Your response, Juan Cole?
Well, I'm a critic of the human rights conditions under this regime in Iran, but you have to admit that Rouhani has a point. Trump has made white nationalism a key element, an open element of American policy, both foreign policy and domestic. Trump has spoken dismissively of many of the countries in the world that are struggling to develop as poor. And he has implemented policies in the United States that clearly are race-based and has spoken dismissively of minorities. And one of the reasons back in the 60s that the U.S. government was so nervous about the civil rights movement was that they were afraid U.S. enemies of the U.S., especially the communists, would take advantage of the fact of Jim Crow and of the racist regime in the United States to turn the world against the country. And I think we're at a juncture where this threat is there again. That is to say, much of the world is in the category that Trump looks down on, and Iran has had a kind of third worldist foreign policy, and it's going to use this to do politics on a global scale against the United States.
And Professor Cole, I want to ask you, while he was dismissive, as you mentioned, of many countries, including some U.S. allies, he declared sort of a pantheon of nations that he believed were making progress in the world, which included Saudi Arabia, which at last time I looked was a complete absolute monarchy, Poland, which is the most right-wing government, arguably, in Europe today, and Israel. I'm wondering about his selection of countries that people should look to for inspiration.
Sure. Well, you know, all of the countries you mentioned have severe human rights problems, and I think Poland is just on the cusp of being sanctioned in the way that Hungary has been for departing from European human rights norms and judiciary norms. Saudi Arabia, as you say, is an absolute monarchy, and despite some cosmetic recent reforms, they do things like sentence bloggers to 1,000 lashes for criticizing the government. Even some of the women who had led the charge on getting the right to drive have now been arrested, now that it's a government achievement, and they're being denied the credit, and they're in jail. So, yes, I mean, Trump exalts these right-wing tendencies. Poland has a very strong anti-immigrant policy, which is part of what Trump admires about them. And it all is, you know, if it's not Nazism, it's certainly racial superiority of what Trump would, you know, categorize as white people.
Early Tuesday morning, President Trump tweeted, "Despite requests, I have no plans to meet Iranian President Hassan Rouhani. Maybe someday in the future. I'm sure he's an absolutely lovely man." Well, later Tuesday, in an interview with CNN's Christiane Amanpour, Rouhani denied Iran had requested a meeting with Trump.
Not this year, nor last year. We have never made such a request for a meeting with the President of the United States. Of course, last year, from American officials, we received 8 requests for a meeting. And I did not see that as being an appropriate meeting, as I do not see it as being appropriate now. And a meeting must take place at a time when that meeting can serve a purpose, can be beneficial, can serve the benefits of both countries. But under the current conditions, when it comes to a meeting and dialogue, I do not see it as beneficial nor appropriate, but you should ask him who made such requests.
So here is Trump saying that despite, you know, Iran's repeated requests, and President Rouhani is saying we made no such requests this year or last year. But talk about the significance of this, Juan Cole, as President Trump declares he's going to have a second summit with North Korea, his relationship with Rouhani and what this means for even places like Syria.
Well, it shows the dangers of having somebody who's frankly unbalanced as the President of the United States. I mean, he lies. He's a pathological liar. Everything that comes out of his mouth is a lie. and to have somebody at the helm of the country who consistently tells these falsehoods is embarrassing. It's very obvious that the Iranians don't want to meet with him and never have wanted to meet with him because they had spent all of 2014 and 2015 negotiating this nuclear deal, and they finally had a breakthrough. They had an international agreement. It's a deal not with the United States, but with the UN Security Council, plus the European Union represented by Germany. And Trump violated that treaty. He withdrew from it and has put the United States on a war footing with Iran to the extent that members of his administration are openly admitting that they are the great Satan. We always took that as an insult. John Bolton seems to enjoy the epithet. So, of course, the Iranians don't want to meet with Trump. And what good would it do does he want to renegotiate the deal? This already has taken years and years of diplomacy, and Trump just withdrew from it. And why wouldn't they expect him to withdraw from the next deal? So, if you have to make a judgment of who's right here, it's obviously Rouhani. But the other thing to say is that it's dangerous to have somebody who lies like this in charge of the United States. We're a superpower. We're a nuclear power. We're doing diplomacy. We have relationship with other countries. This can go to war.
We want to thank you, Juan Cole, for joining us. Professor of History at University of Michigan. His blog, Informed Comment, online at juancole.com. Author of many books, including Engaging the Muslim World. His forthcoming book, Muhammad, Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires, is out in October. When we come back, the man who's credited with crafting President Trump's UN address, Stephen Miller, will speak with Miller's uncle. Stay with us.
Palm of my hand, and I lost it, had a love so real, what a man can feel, and I lost it.
Teddy Pendergrass, the whole town's laughing at me. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to take a closer look at the author of Trump's speech at the United Nations on Tuesday. White House senior advisor Stephen Miller, architect of widely condemned immigration policies such as family separation. Miller also pushed for the recent decision to significantly cut the number of refugees the United States will accept, as well as a proposal that will make it harder for immigrants to become citizens or get green cards if they have ever used a range of public benefit programs, including Obamacare, children's health insurance, and food stamps. This is part of Trump's address that Miller wrote.
Illegal immigration exploits vulnerable populations, hurts hardworking citizens, and has produced a vicious cycle of crime, violence, and poverty.
Well, Trump's anti-immigrant rhetoric and policies, many handcrafted by Stephen Miller, are leading some in Miller's own family to speak out against Stephen Miller. This includes Dr. David Glosser, Miller's uncle, who recently wrote a piece for Politico magazine, headlined, "Stephen Miller is an immigration hypocrite. I know because I'm his uncle." In it, he wrote, "If my nephew's ideas on immigration had been enforced a century ago, our family would have been wiped out." For more, we go to Philadelphia to speak with Dr. Glosser, a retired neuropsychologist and former faculty member at Boston University School of Medicine and Jefferson Medical College, now works as a volunteer with refugees in Philadelphia. Dr. Glosser, welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about Stephen Miller. Talk about your family and why and Stephen Miller's policies?
Well, I'd be happy to talk about it. As you've alluded to, I wrote an article for Politico about a month or so ago in response to what I regarded as intolerable policies in the United States government towards the treatment of refugees. It was a decision I made not lightly in light of the family connection. Please excuse my voice. I've been a bit under the weather lately, so I'll do the best I can. So I made the decision to write this article for two main reasons. One was to make it clear that our family stood for the rights of asylum seekers and refugees, and also because the policies which are being advanced by the Trump administration in terms of refugees, in terms of the management and the treatment of refugees, represent a significant danger to American citizens as well, since it entails a serious attack on democracy. We see here now that American law and policy are being officially made on the basis of race, or religion, national origin, ethnicity. This is a great danger to American citizens as well as to the refugees. If today it becomes normalized in political discussion to be able to make laws and regulations on the basis of this nature, then it exposes all of us to danger of being targeted next. Today it's them, today it could be you, it could be me, it could be anybody.
And Dr. Glusser, have you had occasion to discuss with your nephew some of these policies at all? And is your sense of his direct involvement in shaping them?
As I've made clear with other interviews and with publications, I've only met Stephen Miller perhaps 10 times throughout his childhood, and the last time I had a meaningful discussion with him was probably 5 years ago. So I don't have any insight into this, nor has he specifically discussed anything of this nature with me. What I know about Stephen's positions on immigration, migration, and other policies are entirely from his public persona.
Can you talk about your own family and what would have happened to your family if the immigration policies that Stephen Miller is pushing for were in place when they came to this country?
Well, that's a pretty simple question to answer, and one that is not uncommon. My family originated, at least as far as we can trace, from an area of the former Russian Empire, which is now in the country of Belarus. Our family, my great-grandfather and his family, we believe had been there for a couple of hundred years until the early 1900s. My great-grandfather and his family were dirt poor, lived in a hovel in a tiny townlet of Antipol. They were basically subsistence farmers and traders. Lots of children, some of whom survived into adulthood, some of whom did not. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, the Tsarist regime made it a point of public policy to ramp up persecution of Jewish people living in what was called the Pale of Settlement. This took the form of organized attacks by state-sponsored troops, the Cossacks and so forth, as well as encouraged and unpunished attacks by gangs and other rabble-rousers. So the atmosphere of anti-Semitism was extremely strong. My grandfather, Sam, in fact, as a child, lost an eye in one of these attacks. Not too long thereafter, my great-grandfather, his name was Wolf, made the decision that there was no real viable future for them in that part of the world. And so in 1903, he took passage, he scraped up enough money to take passage on a ship to the United States, where he followed his older brother. He and his older brother did sweatshop work and peddling fruit on street corners in New York City until they were able to raise enough money to bring over the balance of the immediate family. That happened in 1906. The family prospered. We settled in western Pennsylvania, in my hometown of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, which was a burgeoning iron and steel center at the time. And we developed a business which ultimately was listed on the American Stock Exchange, and which hired thousands of people over the years.
And Dr. Glasser, what kind of immigration restrictions existed at the time when your family came, in terms as refugees fleeing those conditions in their home country?
Well, the United States essentially had no serious immigration laws at all until roughly 1882, when the Chinese Exclusion Act was put into place. And at that time, as now, immigration policy in the United States was determined to a great extent upon on labor needs and on racial preferences. After the Chinese Exclusion Act, the next major immigration law had to do was in 1924. The American firsters of the day, who described themselves in that way, were essentially had adopted a nativist position, saying that the only real Americans were those that were already there, white Americans. And they wanted to reduce the number of immigrants coming in entirely, and they wanted to bar immigrants from certain regions and from certain countries. So in 1924, the Exclusion Act of those years essentially barred Catholics from Southern Europe and from Ireland, and Jews from the Russian Empire. Accordingly, the 74 members of our family that had decided earlier not to come to the United States or were unable to go, when war broke out in Europe in the late 1930s, they were unable to come to the United States. We couldn't bring them over. And in our family, there were 74 members that we could trace. None of them survived the war. They were all wiped out, murdered, exterminated. There had been 5,000 Jews in the town of Antipol at its height. At the start of World War II, there were 2,000. After the war, there were 74 who survived. So it's not a theoretical question, what would have happened to the family. It's a real question about what did happen to the family. And the answer is they were all murdered. They had no place to go. Nobody would take them.
I was wondering your reaction, Dr. Glasser, when Stephen Miller's childhood rabbi, Rabbi Neil Kamas Daniels of Beth Shear Shalom, denounced Miller during his Rosh Hashanah sermon earlier this month, calling Stephen Miller a purveyor of negativity, violence, malice, and brutality. He said, quote, "Mr. Miller, you've set back the Jewish contribution to making the world spiritually whole through your arbitrary division of these desperate people. The actions that you now encourage President Trump to take make it obvious to me that you didn't get my or our Jewish message," addressing him by name. Your thoughts about what he's saying about your sister's son?
I'm not an extremely religiously observant person, but I take seriously the admonitions which our faith has given us to protect the refugee and welcome the stranger. So I find myself not in disagreement with Stephen Miller's rabbi. It's the United States is a great country, a large country, a wealthy country. We have wonderful expertise in absorbing refugees and immigrants. The United States also has treaty obligations and laws which enable us and regulate the management of refugee applications in the United States. The current administration is doing everything it can in order to reduce the total number of immigrants, be they legal or illegal. And I think they do it for, frankly, demographic political reasons. Most demographers think that by 2045, that people of predominantly European origin, white European origin, are no longer going to be a majority in the United States. They'll remain a plurality, but not a majority. And it's a demonstrated fact that people of the non-white people are less likely to vote Republican. Accordingly, I think this fits in very well with, this is one of the reasons I think why the Republican Party, which had once been the party of family values and the moral majority, are willing to tolerate Trumpism, which bases itself in... Go ahead.
I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the volunteer work that you've been doing, and also you've worked with some refugees, specifically one from Eritrea that you've talked about in the past.
Since my retirement, I decided to act as a volunteer in these issues. I felt that the immigration issue was very important, and my own family was helped by one of these volunteer organizations, something called HIAS, which my great-grandfather was the first beneficiary in his will, in fact. So I volunteered with HIAS as a neuropsychologist. People who are coming to the United States who make legal application for asylum are called asylees. They're able to, any way that they come to the country, be they at a border legally or whether they just infiltrate the country illegally. People who report and ask for asylum are, according to American law, are allowed to do so and must have a hearing. Part of what they have to do, according to U.S. law and UN and the United States, is also signatory to UN Commission rules and treaties. Part of what they, according to our laws, part of what they have to do is they have to demonstrate that they have a reasonable fear of persecution if they remain in or return to their country, persecution or danger. Now, people like the gentleman in my story, Joseph, who was grossly tortured and mistreated as a child soldier, as a child conscript in his home country of Eritrea, and managed to escape with his life. Upon his exit from Eritrea, they don't provide him with a certificate documenting that he'd been the victim of torture and persecution. So when he gets to the United States after his 10-year journey, he's got to make the case that he has a good reason to be afraid of going back to Eritrea. Accordingly, there are voluntary agencies, such as the ones that I've been volunteering for, who have attorneys, doctors, nurses, psychologists, social workers, and so forth, who help these people to make to establish whether or not they have a reasonable fear of return. So physicians and psychologists, and in my case, a neuropsychologist, will listen to the story and see if there's evidence that people have suffered persecution, torture, and the like, both for the physical and as well as the biological, as well as the mental scars that may arise.
Do you see your work as a kind of atonement for your nephew, Stephen Miller?
No, not at all. I don't have any obligation to atone for anybody else's sins. To the extent that I enact atonement, it would be for my own faults.
Did many
I see this as part of my duty as an ethical human being and as an American citizen.
Did many of your family members agree with you? Did people in your family want you to come forward?
It's an interesting question. Prior to this, I had been writing and speaking on the subject to some degree, but various members of my family implored me to seek a wider audience so that our name not be associated with these policies. After the Politico article came out, I received no less than 100 phone calls, letters, emails, public social media comments, and so forth from family members, both close members and those I don't even know, thanking me for the piece. The other interesting part of this is that after this story went more or less viral on the web, I received literally thousands of contacts through social media, through email and telephone and postal mail from people thanking me for having written it, because so many people have a story just like ours and just like that of other immigrants trying to come into the country to escape persecution. The thing that really surprised me was I had expected a flood of trolls and negative comments and death threats and the like. As a matter of fact, there were only 4 or 5 people who were frank white supremacists and frank admitted Nazis and KKKers and white supremacist types who trolled me. Which, other than that, though, out of the many hundreds and thousands of people, it was a tremendous wave of support. I think people are looking for some sort of how shall we say, a moral clarity on the subject, so that they not be associated with acts like the imprisonment of these 2,500 or 3,000 children at our borders.
Well, Dr. Glasser, we want to thank you so much for being with us. Dr. David Glasser is uncle of Stephen Miller, the senior aide, well known for his anti-immigrant views to President Trump, who, among other things, it's believed crafted Trump's UN speech yesterday. Dr. Glasser, retired neuropsychologist, former faculty member at Boston University School of Medicine and Jefferson Medical College. We'll link to your piece at Politico with the headline, Stephen Miller is an immigration hypocrite. I know because I'm his uncle. Dr. Glasser works with refugees now in Philadelphia. This is Democracy Now! As we turn to continue to look at immigration.
Well, we look at the White House senior advisor Stephen Miller's role in the Trump administration's anti-immigration policy. We turn now to a widely condemned proposal by the Trump administration that would make it extremely difficult for many immigrants to come to the U.S. or receive green cards if they're considered likely to use public benefits like food stamps or Medicaid.
The draft regulation was unveiled Saturday, is drawing protests. For more, we go to Lake Arrowhead, California, by Democracy Now! Video stream to Marielena Incapie, Executive Director of the National Immigration Law Center. Marielena, welcome to Democracy Now! Can you just focus on this latest proposal by the Trump administration? After last week, they floated the proposal to cap the number of refugees to an all-time low that we haven't seen like this in decades in this country.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Amy and Juan. Yeah, this is just the latest radical extremist anti-immigrant attack against families by the Trump administration. And as you mentioned, it's been drafted by Stephen Miller. He has talked about this being the issue that they believe is going to excite their base for the November elections. What this will result in is basically an expansion of the public charge definition, which has been used in our history to exclude people like Jewish refugees, including Catholics from Ireland and Italy. And here we are concerned about this proposed rule, which could affect millions of people in our country, children, their families, who are basically trying to make ends meet. How we live our life and how we contribute to our families and our community should be how we're judged in this country, rather than what we look like and how much money we have. This is basically a wealth test about who belongs in this country and who can come to this country.
And Marielena, could you be specific in terms of what the regulations would entail? Because, as you mentioned, there has been a public charge stipulation that a person cannot have more than a majority of their income from government sources. But now this is being changed to almost any kind of support from government sources. Could you talk about that?
That's right, Juan. Yeah. So for decades now, the public charge definition is if you are an immigrant and you primarily depend on two types of programs, either long-term institutional programs or cash assistance. Here, they're trying to expand this to a range of programs, including food stamps, including housing supports like a Section 8 housing voucher, including the low-income subsidy for Medicare Part D. So again, we have 447 pages that we're still analyzing. The text of the rule hasn't been formally published yet on the Federal Register. When it does, which we expect to be any day now, a 60-day comment period will begin. And we urge everyone who's listening and watching your show today to please go to protectingimmigrantfamilies.org, which is the campaign website that we've set up, and we'll have templates in way everybody can comment on this, right? So physicians, psychologists, educators, state and local elected leaders, but especially immigrants who can tell their story. People like me, when we came in the 1970s, we relied on food stamps. When my parents were laid off in between factory jobs, we would not be here either. And I know that my story is the American story, and that there are thousands and hundreds of thousands of people who can submit comments, and hopefully we can stop this in its tracks.
Marielena Incapie, we thank you so much for being with us, and of course we're going to have you back on to continue to talk about these issues and these regulations as they unfold. Marielena Incapie is Executive Director of the National Immigration Law Center. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the sentencing of Bill Cosby. We'll talk about it in 30 seconds.
Excuse me, but can I be you for a while? My dog won't bite if you sit real still. I got the Antichrist in the kitchen yelling at me again. Yeah, I can hear it. Been saved again by the garbage truck. I got something to say, but nothing comes. Yes, I know what you think of me. You never shut up. Yeah, I can hear that. What if I'm a mermaid in these...
Silent All These Years by Tori Amos. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. This is Democracy Now!
Comedian Bill Cosby is behind bars after a Pennsylvania judge sentenced him Tuesday to 3 to 10 years in prison. In April, a jury found Cosby guilty of 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault for drugging and sexually assaulting Andrea Constant, former director of operations for the women's basketball team at Temple University, at Cosby's home in 2004. Constant is one of some 60 women who have accused Cosby of sexual assaults dating back decades. Cosby had been out on bail since his conviction, and on Tuesday, Montgomery County Judge Stephen O'Neill ordered him to be jailed immediately. The judge also upheld a state board's finding that Cosby is a sexually violent predator, meaning Cosby will have to undergo monthly counseling and register as a sex offender with police for the rest of his life, and neighbors and schools will be notified of his address and crimes. Cosby was first arrested in December 2015 for assaulting Constant. The first trial in 2017 ended with a hung jury. During this trial, the judge allowed 5 additional Cosby accusers to give statements. This is Shalon Lasha, who testified that Cosby sexually assaulted her in 1986.
He ruined my life at 17 years old and took away my future, my financial, everything about me, and lived his life on over and over and over again with no regards. And I think he needs to pay for what he's done to everyone. I have nightmares about it this very day. And I want them to go away, just like him.
Cosby's lawyers plan to appeal his conviction, and he's denied any wrongdoing. This is Bill Cosby's spokesperson, Andrew Wyatt, speaking Tuesday after the sentencing in the pouring rain.
Mr. Cosby's doing great. And Mr. Cosby knows that God is watching over him. He knows that these are lies. They persecuted Jesus, and look what happened. Not saying Mr. Cosby is Jesus, but we know what this country has done to black men for centuries. So Mr. Cosby's doing fine. He's holding up well. And everybody who wants to say anything negative, you're a joke as well. Thank you.
Bill Cosby is the first celebrity to be convicted of sexual abuse since the start of the Me Too movement. For more, we're joined by visual artist, actor Lily Bernard. She's accused Bill Cosby of drugging and raping her in the early 90s when he mentored her in preparation for her guest starring role on The Cosby Show. Welcome back to Democracy Now! As I watched TV yesterday, I saw you coming out of the courtroom. The significance of Bill Cosby being sentenced to 3 to 10 years and being imprisoned right away.
That torrential rain that was pouring down as we were emerging from the courthouse was so serendipitous because Judge Stephen O'Neill, he delivered a tsunami of a sentence. And I view it not only as something that signaled a shift in rape culture away from misogyny and towards believing and valuing women, but I also see it as an absolute mark in terms of gender equality and the history of women's rights towards a positive direction. So it's momentous.
And given how long this battle has gone on, did you ever expect that it would get to this particular point now?
Oh, absolutely not. I was certain that Bill Cosby would die a free man. And I want to say that I'm an Afro-Cuban immigrant, and I love my birth island of Cuba, but I take really seriously my naturalized American citizenship. I don't take it for granted. But this democracy we call the United States is, at the helm of it, we have this white male hetero patriarchy that has sustained itself for generations, for hundreds of years, by oppressing women, by rape, by dominating people of color and LGBT communities. And so this is much greater than Bill Cosby. It talks about that. It talks about this festering wound of patriarchy that is now finally being punctured by brave women on the front line like you, Amy.
Interestingly, Andrew Wyatt, the publicist for Bill Cosby, stood in the pouring rain and said this is the most racist and sexist trial in history.
Oh, that's a joke. This is not about race. It's about rape. And I also heard him intimate that it's a war, that he's suffering a kind of war. And I'm really grateful that he did that.
A sex war that he included Kavanaugh.
And I'm glad he said that, because he's accurate about that. This is a war, and I view Bill Cosby as one of the greatest war criminals in history because he waged warfare on the landscapes of the bodies of so many women and girls, including me. And the weapons that he used may not have been tear gas, may not have been grenades and guns, but they were drugs that incapacitated me. They were his mouth, his penis, a pillow that he pushed into my face when I was screaming no. So yeah, he's a war criminal. This is a war.
And could you talk about your experience this in terms of his trying to present himself as a father figure or as a mentor toward you?
Right. Yes, he's duplicitous. I mean, this is what patriarchy uses, right? They use duplicity in order to oppress, and he is a great oppressor. I view him as not only a war criminal, but as a slaver, because he incapacitated me.
What happened? What year was it?
This was in the 1990s, and he mentored me, he praised me, he lifted me up, he boasted about my skills as not only an actor, but as a painter to his friends. And once
How old were you?
I was in my mid-20s, and once he gained my total trust, he drugged me and he raped me.
You were going to go on the Cosby Show?
Yeah, this happened before. This happened during the mentoring process in preparation of my guest starring role on the Cosby Show. I did end up guest starring on the Cosby Show, and it was the most difficult job I've ever done in my life.
After he raped you?
That's correct.
And he did this at his home?
Well, I don't want to get into the details of it because it's too much to talk about. Suffice to say that I have a plethora of evidence that I was not even able to present because of the statute of limitations. The incident was just a few months out of the statute of limitations, and it barred me. And were it not for the statute of limitations, Bill Cosby would be receiving a sentence that actually reflects the magnitude of the havoc that he's wreaked on the lives of so many women.
Let's go to Gloria Allred.
Yes.
Right after the sentencing, surrounded by so many of the women. This was only a case about one woman, Andrea Constand. But Allred represents a number of Bill Cosby's accusers.
We're glad the judgment day has finally come for Mr. Cosby. Mr. Cosby has shown no remorse. None. And there has been no justice for many of the accusers who were barred from a court by the arbitrary time limits imposed by the statute of limitations.
Raising this issue of the statute of limitations, Gloria Allred was, that also prevented you. But talk about this. Of the 60 women, of course, many of them African-American women.
Yes, over a third. So this is not about race. The United States is comprised of about 5.5% of the population is comprised of black women, and yet over a third of us who have publicly accused Bill Cosby, about 27 of us, are black women. That means that Bill Cosby is actually disproportionately targeting black women. So this is not about race. It is not.
So talk about what this means. He gets 3 to 10 years in prison. He went to jail immediately. The judge stood up when he spoke, didn't he?
Yes, I consider Judge Stephen O'Neill to be a great feminist. I mean, I do. It's phenomenal. I'm grateful that he delivered the maximum 10-year sentence, and he has to serve at least 3 years before he can even be considered parole. And I will be there every step of the way to protest and testify to the parole board for why he should continue to serve the 10-year maximum sentence. But this is
an Andrea Constand's statement in the courtroom. Mm-hmm. Bill Cosby didn't speak, so he never apologized. But Andrea did speak.
Yes, Bill Cosby has absolutely no remorse. And if he continues to show absolutely no remorse, it's not likely that he will be paroled in 3 years. I mean, he's not a stupid man. He's a masterful manipulator. He's an extremely intelligent serial rapist, and he'll probably figure out that in 3 years, if he wants to get out of those bars, then he's going to have to, pretend to care and confess.
Your reaction to Cosby's spouse calling for an investigation of the judge?
That's not the only thing she's done, right? She's also paralleled us to lynch mobs.
You're talking about Camille Cosby.
I'm talking about Camille. She has paralyzed us, the victims of sexual assault, to lynch mobs. She has been verbally attacking females, and many of whom are black women, and just lumping us up with thugs who murder, racist thugs, white supremacists who murder innocent people. And then they paralleled Bill Cosby to Emmett Till, and now they're paralleling Bill Cosby to Jesus Christ. I mean, this is not only blasphemous, it just shows the profundity of their depravity.
We just have 10 seconds,
Yes.
But what this means for Andrea Constand. You, as women, stood together during this trial.
Yeah, Andrea Constand is the Joan of Arc in the war on rape. She has an outstanding family who has just held her up with tremendous strength and unity, and I just think she's going to go down in history.
Judge O'Neill said to Andrea Constand, you took her beautiful young spirit and crushed it. No one is above the law. No one should be treated differently or disproportionately, he said to Bill Cosby. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. That was Lily Bernard.